There is a second, so, and you will speak about this a lot in the conference. So I decided to give you a slightly different insight into what anthropology can contribute to the discussion on economic life and on money, and especially to economic history. And I thought I'll give you a story. I'll tell you a story, a historical story from Poland, which I think is super interesting in the light of modern monetary theory. So I'll just talk about the background. I will talk about the origins of the state in Poland, also the origins of money. So a story from 1,000 years ago, which is, I think, super interesting from a theoretical point of view. And one of the things I think which distinguishes anthropology from all the other disciplines, culture is one thing, but the other one is our kind of inherent cosmopolitanism. Now, anthropology is different from all the other sciences because it was devised to study non-Western societies from the very start, right? So, 100 years ago, there was this idea that you have this modern, complex Western societies, and they need a lot of different academic sciences we need a lot of different academic sciences to actually study what's going on, right? So you had, sociology which studied the society, economics which studied the economy, psychology which studied the individual, political science which studied the political life, and so on and so forth. And now, and anthropology has always been interested in the links between all of them, right? Because the subject of our inquiry from the very onset were not these modern, complex, large societies, but actually very small societies, somewhere in the Trobriand Islands, so to speak, right? So basically, what happened with anthropology is that when anthropologists like Bronisław Malinowski, the first modern anthropologist. Who actually coined this discipline? When he flew over to the Trobriand Islands, he basically did not assume that there is a division between these different realms of human activity, right? So anthropology has always been interdisciplinary from our very onset, because the subject of our inquiry has always been very complex, and has always been this non-Western society where all these different things mix and intertwine. So this broad area of interest is a very anthropological thing that you have mentioned. So we have kind of resisted specialization for a very long time. Specialization has not been a thing in anthropology throughout the 20th century, and I think that's one of the things that is valuable about anthropology in the 21st century. And the second thing I want to start with, and then I'll go into my actual story, is this idea that actually we can learn a lot of things from non-Western societies, and that the West is not really kind of a reference point for us, right? So basically, we have been always trying to understand non-Western societies, and of course, originally there was this idea that these non-Western societies are small, primitive, basic, and that's people on the Trobriand Islands or in the Kalahari Desert are basically kind of our living ancestors, that they have basically they living in a stone age, so to speak, and we are studying our human past as anthropologists. But basically, throughout the 20th century, anthropology has realized that this is actually not the case, that non-Western societies are super complex, super interesting, and they can provide us a very good they can be very good empirical testing ground, right? So basically, the idea is that from a non-Western empirical experience, these non-Western societies can be kind of laboratories for coining new theories. And one of the tenets of anthropology is that you cannot really make general claims without speaking about the particular. So we also do not really distinguish theory and empirical reality. So so for example, if you take a classical anthropological monograph, we don't really have a kind of a theory chapter and then a chapter where we apply the theory. These things are always intertwined, and we use different concepts to actually understand empirical reality. And these, the empirical, the analysis of the empirical reality and our theories have always kind of been mixed and intertwined. And I'm speaking about this because I think a lot of the discussion about economic history, the origins of capitalism, the origins of the world we are living in, and also the origins of money, have basically had a very narrow empirical base. So basically, if you read 20th century discussions about the origins of capitalism, for example, right, then you see that basically it's the Atlantic world, especially the UK, which is actually the testing ground, which is the area, the empirical reality, which gives rise to certain theoretical concepts and certain theoretical debates. And what has happened in the last, let's say, 15 to 20 years is this post-Occidental turn, namely that people are speaking from different places in the world. So they are bringing in different empirical experiences, different stories, different realities from outside of the Western core. And by doing so, they actually enrich our theoretical understanding of kind of larger processes. So this is basically what I'm gonna do. And I think Poland has kind of entered these global meta discussions in the 20th century, basically once. I mean, I'm not talking about Kalecki, and his work. I'm talking about the Polish historical experience. So some of you may have heard about the Polish School of Economic History. If not, then you quite probably have heard about Immanuel Wallenstein, who was a figure who basically coined his theory of the origins of capitalism and the world systems by reading Polish and Hungarian economic historians like Witold Kula, Jerzy Topolski, Andrzej Wyczański, and so on and so forth. But that's been quite a long time ago. And I think since there's an interesting discussion and there's interesting research going on within Polish history, and actually on the interstice between Polish history, medieval history, and archaeology, which I think gives us kind of a second interesting case, which we can then, try to move up to the higher kind of order of analysis, namely to kind of try to devise some broader, more general conclusions from this particular story. So that's what I'm gonna do, and I think I should share my screen now. Okay, and I guess you can see this. So what I'm going to talk about. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm still handicapped with my. I've been. Okay, great. So it works now. So what I'm going to talk about is a part of a book I wrote in Polish in 2017. It has a title which is difficult to render in English. I have actually an English language version of it, which actually is a different book. So it's the basic tenets of that book from 2017 is in this manuscript. I have it in my drawer because for various reasons I didn't have the time to look for a publisher yet. But it's from 3 chapters on the origins of capitalism and money that I wrote in 2017. Now, I came across MMT after only I wrote this book. So I think there's an interesting, so a lot of the things that I was writing about there, and especially the kind of credit theory of money, of course, I knew it from elsewhere, but the more the actual MMT and how MMT looks at the role of the relationship between the state and money creation was something that I read later on. But it's interesting because it's quite congruent with actually the story or the actual historical case that I'm going to talk about. So in other words, what I'm going to talk about is a historical case, which I think basically confirms the basic ideas of MMT. Now, I'm not saying exactly this in the book, but I think in hindsight, I can say this, and of course, I'm quite interested, in what you guys, in what kind of thoughts this empirical case, this example I'm going to talk about, and gives you. The book got a prize for an economic book, which for me as an anthropologist was a surprise, but it was actually a nice surprise. So Now, the basic thing that I'm doing in the book is to update this 20th century discussion about the origins of capitalism, and I do this by via Karl Polanyi, who, as you probably know, had this idea that you have three fictitious commodities: land, labor, and money. And what I do in this book, I basically say that, look, if you actually see what happened after Wallenstein in this discussion about within economic history, then basically there are two paths, and that two strands of literature that emerged after Wallenstein. The first one actually says, look, what Wallenstein was writing about was anachronistic. Like, there was no breakthrough in 16th, 17th century Europe. Capitalism is actually much older than he thought. And, you know, if you read Jack Goody, David Graeber, and many other, James Scott, then you see that these guys are actually saying, look, you have to go back to antiquity to actually understand the origins of the modern world, the origins of money, the origins of state, and the origins of capitalism as such. Perhaps David Graeber is the best example of this kind of thinking. Another line of research went into the opposite direction. Namely, it said, actually, look, Wallenstein writing about bulk trade in goods, in wheat, and in between Eastern and Western Europe in the 17th century was totally anachronistic, in the sense that there was no bulk trade in goods at that time. Grain markets across states were totally not integrated. Of course, there was some grain that moved from one place to another, but basically, if you look at the volume and not at the value of that trade, it was like totally minuscule from a modern point of view. And, you know, Jan de Vries famously wrote that basically all the commodities that were shipped from Asia to Europe as late as in 1800 could be placed on today's modern shipping container. And of course, you know, so the actual what Wallenstein was writing about, so the integration of grain markets across the world actually came much later with the railroad and the steamship. And there's a great book by Mike Davis, The Late Victorian Holocaust, where he actually shows this, but this happened only in the late 19th century. So you have these two strands. Some of them are saying, look, capitalism is much older than Wallenstein thought. Others are saying capitalism is much younger than Wallenstein thought. So the watershed, between whatever, however you call this, feudalism, the old world, the ancient regime, however you call this, and the modern world, however you describe this, is actually much later, especially also environmental historians. And Mike Davis he can be described as one of those, are basically saying this, that, actually something new, something strange, something unprecedented happened only in the late 19th century. And this is the beginning of the modern world, however you want to call this. You can call this capitalism, you can call this by some other name, it doesn't really matter. This is the historical reality. Also the discussion here, you can call it Anthropocene, right? The watershed is also in the late 19th century. So I'm basically saying, I'm actually trying to resolve this paradox by the way of Polanyi, saying that actually you can describe this transition from ancient to modern capitalism by looking at these three fictitious commodities. And the argument is that actually the ancient capitalism was based only on two of them, on labor, but not on wage labor, but slavery, and on money, but not not bullion, but actually credit money, or state-issued, state-backed money. And the difference between ancient and modern capitalism is that land became a commodity. And so here I also insert David Harvey and this entire discussion on the link between modern capitalism and urbanization, how urbanization became super important for the way modern capitalism works. So that's the kind of the background, that's the general story. And this is a graph where I actually describe this. I'm sorry, it's in Polish, but I'll explain this. So this is based on Angus Madison's data, where I basically show that 1870 is the watershed. And 1870 is the moment where the Atlantic bloc, which is the black line here, actually became the top dog in the world economy. Now, for various reasons, I don't really like the GDP per capita statistics that are often used by economic historians to compare different parts of the world. I'm actually using a different one here, which is also very basic, but I think which gives a much better indication of actually what was going on and what was the relationship between different parts of the world, namely share of the global GDP. Right, so you basically see that, and another thing I'm doing here, of course, which is actually inventing comparable units. Right, so one of the problems with these cross-country comparisons is that they are bogged by national methodological nationalism. Right, so you compare Luxembourg and China, Iceland and India, right? Blocks, territorial and population blocks, which are totally uncomparable, right? So what I did here, I basically added, I coined this thing called continental block, which was basically Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, from Madison's data, and this is the green line here. I also coined something which I call the Atlantic bloc, which is basically the US and the UK. Again, we know that the American and the British economy and the rise of both of them to the global supremacy, of course, at a different point, was connected, right? We know from the work of Sid Mintz and many others that there will be no industrial revolution in the UK without the Caribbean sugar, and so on and so forth. So this is basically UK plus the US, and this is China, and this is India. So you see that basically there is an interesting moment in 1870, which is very, very late, when the Atlantic bloc becomes the top dog, right? So the share gets the largest share of the global economy. The peak of the Atlantic domination here is in 1950. And of course, what happens later on, is the decolonization and the gradual comeback of China to the actual, role of an important economic player. So that's the general gist of the book. And these are my English chapters. So I'm looking for a publisher, and I finished just another book in Polish, which took a lot of time. So this is something I'm going to devote to. Now, devote my time to. Now, one of the things, so the thing I'm going to talk about from that project is this idea of origins. And this is something we are super interested in anthropology, and there is a lot of discussion within anthropology on the origins of the state, on the origins of society, on the origins of class, and also on the origins of money. And the last thing that is perhaps the interest we also share with economic historians, and also with those who adhere to MMT. So this is the story, and the story is interesting because there is a very kind of a classical textbook narrative about the origins of this Polish state that we all get from a high school textbook, which basically was a consensus from around 1960s, 1970s, and the story is that there used to be tribes. Some of them were called Polanie, and then these tribes there was a charismatic leader who united these tribes, and then these tribes evolved into a state, and then one of these charismatic leaders became a king, and then he started minting money, and then from this minting money, there was trade, and there was urbanization, there was cities, and there was merchants, and all the rest of it, right? So there was a story of a gradual evolution from a kind of a native local tribe into a state structure. It was a kind of a evolutionary story. So it was an evolution from a primitive to a more complex society. It was evolution from a primitive on all the different levels, right? So primitive from a cultural point of view, primitive from a economic point of view, primitive from the point of view of social stratification, and so on and so forth. Now it turns out it's total crap. It's just not true. And in the last 15-20 years, there's been a veritable revolution in archaeology. So basically, all this theory of the kind of evolutionary theory of the origins of the Polish state And of course, the idea was also that the Polish state was linked with Germany, with the West, right? Like with the Latin West. That was a big part of that story. That these were these kind of barbaric tribes, and basically 1,000 years ago, one of these charismatic leaders, he also baptized, he became a Christian, and this kind of opened the door to civilization, right? And Poland, for the last 1,000 years, have been part of this Western civilization, has been actually the bulwark of the Western civilization against the kind of Eastern barbarism and so on and so forth, right? Now, so this revolution in archaeology, so this story was based on texts, right? So on the interpretation of texts. Most of them actually came later, right? So most of them came 100, 150, 200 years after the actual events. Now, it turns out it's totally not true. And what archaeologists have been digging out actually is a kind of a springboard, is empirical data, which propels us into a very different direction, which allows us to tell a very different story. So it's interesting because these archaeologists have been trying to kind of weave this story. And of course, it's highly speculative. So what I'm going to tell you is also, of course, highly speculative. But I'm kind of bringing in my anthropological knowledge and the things we know from anthropology and things we know about this transition from this putative transition from a tribal and a simple to a state and a complex society. And what they've been digging most prominently are dirhams, so coins which do not come from the West, but which come from the world of Islam. And they've been digging them out in enormous quantities. Okay, so it's like millions, and so it's not just a few coins; it's a lot of them. And it's interesting that they've been also hoarded. So there are these areas where these coins have been hoarded. So they have found these hoards, and there's a lot of them. Now, it's interesting that they also are shredded. So you can see, so they have been cut into smaller pieces. And this propels us into a very different direction. And of course, the key story here is so the key question is, how do they get there, right? I mean, who brought them there, who dug them, and what do they tell us about the place of Poland in the larger world 1,000 years ago? So of course, the key hero of this story is slavery, right? Because the countries these coins came from the areas of today's Iran, most of them, and the only thing that this part of the world actually had to offer, areas which were actually the actual center of the world economy at that time. So the West was not really the top dog at the time, but the actual center of the economy was in the world of Islam, were basically only human bodies. So we're actually coming back to the issue of slavery, because of course, pre-war historians actually knew very well that the earliest Polish kingdoms, the earliest Polish rulers were actually slave raiders. So this is a very different story about the origins. So what I'm doing in the book, and what I want to do here now, is to look at the role of this money and what this empirical story actually tells us about how money is created and what it actually is. So one of the things you can do is to read Islamic scholars, right? So if we look at the way these dirhams were talked about at that time, well, for somebody who's versed in the credit theory of money and who's versed in MMT, this is actually a very familiar idea, right? So money has nothing to do with trade. Money is about the state, and it's one of the instruments the state uses to govern. right? So the interesting question is, how was the Polish state connected with, which was actually the very end of a certain trade route, and I'll show you this in a second. How was it connected? Now, there is a great book, and so here we're entering the non-Occidental area that I talked about in the beginning, right? I told you that a lot of theories have been coined on the basis of the Western experience, right? The origins story of Poland have been very Occidental, that, we have been this primitive tribe that then was given, the door to civilization was opened to us, and we went through it and we became a European Christian Catholic society, modern, complex, and so on and so forth. Now, it turns out actually the initial push to state creation in Poland did not come from the West, but it came from the world of Islam. And money was a very important element of that story. Now, and if you read other economic historians who actually write about money from a non-Western perspective, and Richard Fogland is one of them, then you see that this, so the idea of money as a shadow king is not Islamic. It comes from China. It comes from this book by Richard Fogland. So very old thinkers, non-Western thinkers, actually had a very interesting conception of the role of money and the relationship between the money and state. And I think it fits much better to this case that I'm going to talk about, right? So I'm using non-Western theories, actually, right, historical theories, to understand this historical. Okay, I'm sorry. This is again my handicap. So I hope I will restore this. Okay, we're back. Now, so this is the actual map of the world at that time, and this is the map of these slave routes. Actually, so this was the center of the world, the world of Islam, and you see that there were two slave routes. The one which is in red here, so this is the western one, and the eastern one, the one which is here in blue. The dots here are the areas where these silver hoards were found. So you can see that they are only in the eastern part, which is basically East Europe plus Scandinavia. This is the area, and Poland is of course here. The black dots are the center, the transit.
Ok. J'ai reçu un mail, mais n'est pas ouvert.
Somebody has.
Il y a quelque chose.
Could you silence that phone, please? Okay, thanks. So you see that Poland was. This is the actual place of Poland on the map of that world. 1,000 years ago. So we were not kind of in the vestibule of the West. We were at the very end of these slave routes that were facing the world of Islam, which is here. And now there is one textual source, which is a relation of a Jewish merchant who comes from Cordoba, from Islamic Spain, who writes about this how parts of the world. He went as far as Prague, and then also wrote about the Polish kings. And it's interesting because in the Czech areas, in the territories of contemporary Czechia, there was also the state was also issuing its own kerchief money, so textile money. And again, the way they spoke about them also rings a familiar tone. Now, what actually happened is that also within this archaeological revolution, there was another new insight, new data that allowed us to bury this evolutionary theory, namely the very fact that dates of settlements now are being dated with carbon technologies and not through ceramics. So in the 20th century, they found a piece of ceramic and they would say, okay, it was like circa from like 8th century or 9th century or the beginning of 10th century and so on and so forth. So it was very kind of rough. Now with the carbon technologies, you can actually date settlements in a very precise way, like down to basically like the decade. Right. So what they have also found was that there was basically a total demographic and demographic revolution, and also revolution in settlement. So this is a map of the Wielkopolska, so the Poznań area, which was the heart of the earliest Polish state. And basically, what you see here is that there was a whole wave. So there was a lot of settlements which were destroyed around the 10th century. So this is the time when the Polish state was being formed, and these are the orange and red dots. And there was also a lot of new settlements. So basically, there was a kind of a settlement revolution going on, and we can actually date them quite precisely. There was these 4 waves of settlement. Now, the interesting thing is that also on these dirhams, you can also date them quite precisely because they had a date minted on them, right? So we can actually, we know if you find a dirham, you know where it came from, and you know when it was actually minted. And there's a fantastic correlation between these 4. So these dirhams came in 4 waves in the 10th century, 4 distinguished waves. And these 4 distinguished waves actually totally correspond with these different cycles of destruction and construction of settlements, right? So basically what you see here is that there's somebody who comes in. So you can translate this into the actual story, how what actually happened, right? So somebody comes in, they capture some people, they sell them off as slaves, they get money from that, and they invest this into construction. So they invest this into construction of these kind of settlements, which were quite large and quite sophisticated from a technological point of view at that time. And then they can, with these technologies, both military and settlements, so both settlements and also the military kind of capacities that these things entailed. They could venture for another round of pillage and capturing, sold those people off, and kind of embarked on a 3rd and the 4th wave of investment. So there's a perfect correlation, temporal correlation between these things, and it's super interesting. So it also shows us that basically there was a revolution. There was no a evolution in the sense that somebody came in from the outside. Because it was impossible. It was impossible for locals at the time to actually devise such a sophisticated, both military and technological enterprise. So of course, it goes against this idea that this was a local tribe that actually emerged, that actually evolved into a state formation. It's actually quite congruent with the way we think about the origins of the state in anthropology. If you read guys like Pierre Clastre or James Scott, who wrote a fantastic book about the origins of the state called Against the Grain recently, then you see that it's actually impossible for tribal societies to evolve into a state society, from a, let's say, theoretical point of view. Tribal societies, which Pierre Clastre and James Scott, they call them non-state societies, are not prior in time, so they are not kind of survivors from the Stone Age, but they are external in space. So in most of the cases, these tribal societies are actually runaways from the state, runaways from the institution of slavery. So they are on the margins of the state societies in a spatial sense. And this was basically, so this area was actually giant forest and was actually quite peripheral to state formations for a very long time. And then something interesting happened in the territories of contemporary Czech Republic, namely quite a large state collapsed there. So there's a theory that actually elite from this Czech, or actually Moravian state escaped to this forest in Wielkopolska and the areas of Poznań, and then rebuilt their state over there, right? So this is a story where the state always comes from the outside. It kind of, moves like a frog, it jumps from an area to an area to an area to an area. It collapses and then it's being reborn somewhere else. And this archaeological data actually confirms that theory. So the interesting thing, and that's perhaps the last thing I wanna talk about here in a greater detail, is the way money was actually used for this, right? Because they had a lot of, let's say, know-how. There was a technological know-how, there was a military know-how, but there was also quite an acute understanding of how you can govern by the means of money, right? We know also that the early Polish elite was actually quite cosmopolitan. There's always been two theories: the one that they came from the north, so they were Vikings, and the other one that they came from the south, so they were Moravians. And the southern theory is more popular with archaeologists nowadays. So the interesting thing is the silver, right? Because this is something they got from the center of that world, from the world of Islam, and it's interesting what they did with this in order to kind of to strengthen their enterprise, right? So we know that they have invested the money into construction, so to speak, but that was not only it, right? So of course we know that they needed money to buy weapons. They needed this silver to buy soldiers. But it's also interesting, and this is the second quote on the right-hand side actually indicates this. They also kind of inserted silver into the local non-state or pre-state society. So they created kind of a circulation of silver, quite a shallow one, quite probably, right? But they were quite skilled in understanding how to govern with money. So the quote on the left-hand side basically shows us that the silver was used for salaries, right? So it also confirms, for example, what David Graeber was writing about, namely that wage labor originated not in factories as we thought in the 20th century, but actually originated in the army, right? So the soldiers are the very first wage laborers in history. So we see this here, right? We have a kind of a cosmopolitan elite, which is paid in silver, which from that silver they can get luxury items, ornaments, items of speculative consumption, so on and so forth. Things which also appeared in these territories of Wielkopolska out of the blue in the 10th century, right? So this revolution that archaeologists are writing about is not only about the money and the constructions, but also a very different lifestyle that emerges, that appears on these territories, together with the silver and together with the new settlement. But for me as an anthropologist, the second quote on the right hand side is more interesting, because it shows how Mieszko I, so this was the name of the first Polish leader, and the quote pertains to him, was actually using money and using the institution of kinship and the institution of dowry to build alliances with the local tribes. So I think my theory, which is it's of course built on many theories of archaeologists, but I'm kind of taking it into an anthropological, I'm taking it a step further through my anthropological understanding, is that it was a revolution, of course, right? In the sense that these guys came from the outside, they destroyed tribes which were there, enslaved perhaps some of them, but they were also quite weak, so they had to get into an alliance with the locals. So I think you see here that Mieszko is basically, he becomes a kind of a father figure in the sense that he takes every newborn child under his tutelage, both male and female. He pays them with silver, and this is why you see the silver shredding, for example, right? These didn't have to be large quantities of silver. And then, and then it allows, so this is how he inserts the money into the local economy. Now, of course, he takes it back. How he takes it back, that's another story, and we don't know this from written sources. We don't know this from archaeological sources, but we can speculate now. So, of course, taxes would be the most obvious way, but also ransom. So we know this from research about slavery as an institution at that time, that ransom was a very common thing to do. So you would basically capture children, because also children or adolescents were quite often the best kind of slave material. You capture them, but instead of shipping them a very long distance to to Baghdad or Samarkand, you just basically blackmail their parents, and you demand payment from their parents. So this also I think explains the civil hordes, because you can see that slavery was basically kind of a blood money, right? It was a form of money which was associated with the slave trade and was associated with the state. The state was basically a slaving operation. It was nothing more than that, which also explains why these silver dirhams were buried, right? Because there was no market at the time. One of the things that we have to remember about these areas is that there was basically no urbanization whatsoever. So this old theory that money was somehow connected with trade, you can throw it out of the window, because it's basically not backed by historical and archaeological data. So there's an interesting kind of way he's using money, and he's creating kind of a whole circuit of money creation, which kind of boosts his power, both external, in the sense that it allows him to buy things he needs, like the mercenaries and the weapons and the horses and the luxury items, but also he kind of enters into some kind of an alliance with the local tribes. And you can see that, the man who has two or three daughters, thanks to this dowry deal and the way the Mieszko is actually orchestrating these marriages, one family can actually become very rich. So they join, so it's the locals who are joining this cosmopolitan, affluent, state-connected elite, and then those who have sons fall into destitution. But the sons, of course, are necessary for Mieszko as soldiers, right? So you can see that he's actually alienating sons from their parents, right? And we know that he was basically recruiting. So through this, we can assume that he was recruiting also soldiers locally, young men who had nothing to lose, because their fathers and their families of origins were falling into destitution. So they would be happy to join and become mercenaries for the state. So it's an interesting, it's all, of course, two paragraphs and a very scanty data, but I think we can kind of weave an interesting story, which tells us a very different story about the origins of the state and the role of money. Now, of course, slavery does not disappear from Poland, but there's an interesting. So it's part. Slavery in a literal sense does not disappear. It's part and parcel of the landscape until the 16th century, where there's an interesting kind of a transition, and actually found kind of one paragraph of a statues where there was a kind of a smoking gun to what happened with the institution of slavery in 16th century Poland. Namely, the very word for slaves was banned, or let's say there was an agreement that it's people who are performing the most the hardest physical laborers. They should no longer be called slaves, but they should be called servants. And it's interesting because also at that time in the West, where the Portuguese became the top players in the slave trade, and the Portuguese were importing slaves from West Africa, the word "esclavos" kind of replaces servus as the key term for slaves. So you basically see that there are kind of domestic slaves in Poland, and from the 17th century they are basically called servants, and the institution of a servant became super important for the next 300-400 years, and serfdom was basically based on that, because it was actually peasant servants who were actually doing serfdom in 17th and 18th century Poland. So there was an interesting transition of the institution of slavery, but that's another story. And my second book is actually about that. And there's also an interesting money story within this. So there was this idea that actually the Polish state, the Polish state has always been kind of very weak on money, right? So for example, though there is this argument propelled by 20th century historians that this serfdom, the second serfdom, Poland, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century was a state where there was basically no money, which is not really true, because there was a lot of actually private money coined by the different kind of owners of these grain-producing latifundia. But that's another story, and my time is slowly running out, so I'm not going to really focus on that. But I have a second book which kind of takes up this this story about how money is used by people to kind of boost and organize their power or their dominion. So I think these are the major lessons for this story, that money is connected with slavery, and the origins of money and the origins of slavery are closely intertwined. There's a big research on this. Blood Money. There's a book that came out a couple of I think 2 years ago or a year ago on this. The role of wage labor, that's another element of that. So that's another proof for for the kind of correct intuition of David Graeber. The role of the state as a money creation. Spatial fixes, I didn't really talk about this, but it's interesting. In the actual book, I'm also using David Harvey to understand this relation between these different cycles of investment into fixed capital, into construction. Of course, not urbanization in a modern sense, but kind of settlements in archaic state. But these settlements are interesting because they are not, they have nothing to do with trade, right? So it also shows you a different kind of a story within the urbanization, because there's also this evolutionary idea that trade, money, and urbanization are somehow connected. And here we have somehow some form of a settlement, which is not really urban in a kind of a trade sense, but it's so there's no trade going on. There's only the state and their elite who are basically preying on human bodies and on slaves. So that's a very different kind of a story, and a very different case that also kind of deconstructs this Occidental narrative about the origins of urbanization, how this is linked with trade and with money. And again, it's interesting that we have this non-evolutionary situation, right? That actually agriculture was not an important element of that. I didn't really speak about it that much, but I devote a lot of time to this, a lot of space to this in the book, because we have again this evolutionary sequence, the sequence that you have a tribe society, then you have they have agriculture, and then society kind of becomes more complex, and then you have a trade, you have these merchant towns, and then you have kind of proto-industrialization, and then you have the modern economy. This is kind of the classical story in a nutshell. And here you have very different jumps, very weird jumps, because it's the state which is interested in services of the local population initially. And one of the things I didn't really talk about, but that's a big topic here, are these kind of so-called servile settlements, osady służebne, which were elements of this new landscape of settlements by the Polish state. And they were basically different, and they were basically where they would settle slaves, right? So I spoke about how slavery was a kind of a push that propelled the Polish state into existence. But another story here is also how they used the institution of slavery to actually build the actual state, right? So there was a certain point when they stopped exporting the slaves, but they were actually resettling, like reorganizing the landscape of the country with settlements where actually slaves were placed, and they were specialized. So there was one settlement was specialized in the production, of wine. Another settlement would specialize in the production of bread. Another settlement would specialize in the production of ceramics and so on. And there was a whole kind of a network of these settlements. So you can actually think of this as a kind of a sprawling city, right? It was not centralized. It was not, kind of a central place, but it was a whole kind of a constellation of these different settlements that would actually perform different services for the state, and each of the settlements was populated by slaves. So agriculture was part of this, but it was not the thing, So it's interesting. It was actually super modern from a certain point of view. And the point number 6 is that it's interesting because in the 20th century there's this evolutionary line of development. That one thing comes first, and then another thing comes later on, and through a gradual kind of evolution, the modern kind of a complex emerges, right? So, for example, there's the idea that you need agriculture for the state to emerge, right? And then you have a primitive form of organizing labor like slavery, and then you have a more complex thing, and industrialization comes later on, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a certain kind of a sequence to how the kind of the state complex emerges. Now we know now, and the work of James Scott is perhaps the best case in point, that it's not true. So we know of societies which have a state but do not have agriculture. We have agricultural societies which basically have no state formation. The same goes, for complex social, complex material culture like pottery. There was always this idea that complex pottery is a kind of a token of a complex social structure, but it's not really true. You can have complex complex societies with a very primitive pottery, and hunting and gathering societies with a very complex pottery, and so on and so forth, right? So these things are not really linked by default, but the state actually does represent a package at certain points. So at least in the year 1000 AD, I think the state was a package, and you see this very clearly. That basically, in a very short span of time, which is basically 1 or 2 generations, 40 years or so. This all happened within 40 years, right? All the things we associate with the state. So social hierarchy, money, slavery, taxes, literacy, complex technologies, complex settlements, ornaments, and all these kind of things, they all come together at once, right? Class hierarchy, all these things happen in once. And there was always this discussion, what comes first, For example, the Brenner debate in the 70s, that, class is the kind of this scaffolding on which capitalism emerged, right? So Robert Brenner, he argued that class comes first, right? So hence the agrarian origins of capitalism. And then an economic kind of life that we call capitalism emerged on the scaffolding of class. Here we have a very different story, that these things appear all at once in a package. And the very last point number 7, is the thing that I started with, right? That to understand, both the place of Poland in the larger world, we need to forget about Occidentalism, right? We need to forget about looking at the West. West was has not always been the center of the world. It became the center of the world very late, and was the center of the world for a very short period of time, like 150 years. If we take 2020 as the end of the kind of Atlantic, as the end point of the Atlantic hegemony. So of course, within that 150 years, though, the West was the magnet, it was the center of the world. But before that, no. And so to look at the role of Poland, the place of Poland in the world 1,000 years ago, and assuming that Poland, it was in the vestibule of the West, is just basically, it's total nonsense. But that's the kind of that's the local significance. But I think for us, what's interesting here is that we have a new empirical case from which we can draw new different kind of conclusions, right? So I think for those who are interested in the origins of money, how money actually works, what's the relationship between money and the state, and how the state issues money in order to execute power. I think this is a super interesting case. And I think my final kind of plea would be to get MMT economists interested in history, because I don't think there's much interest in history. If you read guys who are kind of in the forefront of MMT right now, they all kind of write about the US most of the time, right? Contemporary US, which is fine, which is okay. But I think there's actually a lot of interesting historical ground to cover, and that's just one of the many stories that we can tell. So thanks a lot, and I think I finished actually exactly within 60 minutes as I was told. So I give the floor back to the organizers.
Thank you, Professor Pobłocki, for your insightful lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your lecture. And now I would like to give the floor to the audience. Maybe we have some questions, comments regarding what Professor Pobłocki has just said during his lecture. Well, personally, I think, whether we should now rewrite books we are using at schools in Poland to teach children our history about the origins of Poland. Well, but still, do we have some comments, questions from the audience? Yes, Gilles, please.
Yeah, can you hear me? Thank you very much, Professor. Yes. Thank you very much for such a